Thank you, Professor Heckman. それでは、ちょっと時間も限られていますが、一つか二つフロアから質問を。We're going to open up the questions.
今の説明聞いて、かなり合理的な意見やと思ったんですけど、どの国でもあると思うんです。例えばブラジルでしたら、例えば貧しいファベーラの子どもたちはの多くが満足な教育を受けられなくて犯罪を染めやすくなってテロも起きやすくなると思うんですよ。でもあなたは恵まれたい人に投資することはハイリターンである、つまり経済的に損と言いましたけど、恵まれない子どもたちが貧困から抜け出しにくい構造になると、さらに貧困の差が大きくなって大きなテロとか紛争とか起きるかもしれないと思うんですけど、それでも仕方ないということですかね。
No, I clearly wasn't clear if you asked that question. What I certainly am not saying is that we can't change the conditions of disadvantaged children. In fact, in Brazil, there has been a substantial improvement in something called Bolsa Familia, which is a family program targeted directly towards disadvantaged children. But there's a growing awareness in Brazil and many other countries around the world that the way you target poverty most effectively, especially for the children in the favela, is to actually provide those children with the resources, the parenting, the early education, the stimulation that plays such a huge role. And in fact, the real measure of poverty is not only reduced. Out in Western Brazil, for example, there is real poverty. There are real nutrient deficiencies. That wouldn't be true, I think, in Japanese society, but certainly true in Brazilian society, Western China, parts of India, very severe. So what I'm suggesting is, of course, we can target the disadvantaged children. And we can target it, I think, though, by not just providing money. It's not just a question of money. It's providing the kind of parental resources, providing access to education. Now, Brazil is a particularly dramatic case because we know that in the northeast of Brazil, there was substantial limitation of schools, that many schools in the northeast of Brazil 20 years ago did not even have buildings, that schools were held in trees, that there were no books. And so that was a case where obviously increasing schooling resources could have, and did have substantial increase in promoting opportunity. And in fact, the Brazilians are proud. The Gini coefficient is very high in Brazil, but it's gone down. And there's a perception that inequality and opportunity has actually been reduced. So yes, we can, but I think we have to target it wisely. So I agree with you that growing up in the favela is very bad, that these environmental influences, that's exactly what I meant by talking about the child as an emergent system, that the environment, it takes more than just the father and the mother to raise the child, that the whole environment matters, and that growing up in a very stressed environment can play a very negative role. But I also think we should really get at the foundation, which I still think is the family, and recognize in Brazil there are many children born into very disadvantaged circumstances. And the disadvantage is not just one of money. The disadvantage is one primarily of parental ignorance, parental neglect, and parental lack of concern. There are many, many children in that situation. And I think the greatest advantage, the greatest opportunity is to address those questions and to target then the capabilities in building those children. So certainly anything I said earlier was not meant to say that that was not an impossible problem. That was not a possible solution. We can address those problems, and the kind of techniques I'm talking about and methods and policies do so.
Thank you. ちょっと時間がもうだいぶ限られてしまいましたので、大変申し訳ございませんが、質問はここで締めさせていただき、それでは本日お忙しい中出席いただいております清家敦塾長に、総括のコメントをいただきたいと思っておりますが、よろしいでしょうか。More questions? じゃあ正規局長からのサジェッションですので、あともう一つ二つ質問があれば OK。
Thank you very much. My question will be in English, so I don't think you will need any translation.
Okay.
On that end, it's concerned very much with the United States, and I understand that this might be very focused on this country. But my question is about affirmative action policies and socioeconomic-based policies in terms of college admissions.
Yes.
And in terms of what your thoughts are on that, and in terms of effectiveness of these programs, because your findings would imply that these would almost have a negligible difference, and that these types of programs might not really be necessary in making a difference in terms of outcomes for the people concerned.
Well, that's a very good question, and in fact, you're absolutely right. That's what the implication would be, that I would argue that much of the way that we've approached these problems, like in the United States, there's a tremendous interest among college presidents, especially among the elite universities, but just true generally across all universities, of trying to make sure that children who are disadvantaged by various measures, by race, by income, by various kinds of techniques, by various measures, I mean, gain access to college, and that we should target those children. But I think what's missing is an understanding that the skill base, if it's not present, that when you're 18 or 20, it can be very difficult. So we found in the United States, when we take children from certain disadvantaged groups and put them into environments that are quite advantaged, where children have grown up at a disadvantage, where there are gaps, for example, in the SAT scores of 300 or 400 points, that in many cases the children don't benefit so much from that environment. And that I would argue, and I think I've argued strenuously with various presidents of, or former presidents of universities like my own at the University of Chicago, Princeton, at Harvard, and other groups, that in fact it's too late, that there may be some gain, there may be some disadvantaged children, but it kind of misses this whole life cycle strategy, that those gaps are there. Those gaps are there at 8th grade. Their gaps are there at 6th grade. Well, we can do something about the gaps. And so these people, I mean, it's a natural mistake. College presidents naturally are worried about college students, and they should be, and that's their job. But the question is, how did the college students get to be in that way? So we know that some of the highest returns from college can come from those people who are very bright and highly motivated. We see that. And that's, people don't like to hear that, but it's true. The advantage and that the people who have these high levels of skills. But what the new thinking is that we can change that level of skill base. But we have to start somewhat earlier, or at least we have to complement existing strategies. So I don't want to say that all affirmative action policies are bad. I'd say there are certain issues that arise in application of affirmative action policies that can be very undesirable. I personally, and this is from my own perspective, do not like the idea of distinguishing anything on the basis of race or sex. I think, to me, it just runs counter to the idea of equality. And I think it's well-intentioned by many people. But I think it misses the point that many of these gaps, some have been truly denied. Women were not admitted to law schools and medical schools, places like Princeton and so on. That's clearly a basis for, I wouldn't call that affirmative action. I would say it's reducing discrimination. So there's a very sharp difference between affirmative action and reducing discrimination. So I would argue that reducing discrimination is a very, very powerful and potent tool. But the notion of somehow focusing on individuals on the basis of some measure of disadvantage, at least in the case of education, has a very negative effect in the sense it redirects attention away from building the skill base where we can get tremendous gains. So we have seen, for example, that disadvantaged children, even in the Chicago public schools, we have a very serious problem. We have, right now, there are more children, males, in the Chicago public schools who go to prison than who go to college. That's a huge problem. So we ask, how do we address that problem? Well, we have ways of remediating that. One way is interventions, even in these non-cognitive skills, even in the adolescent years. We can do that. Starting even earlier in terms of the skill base can even be more powerful. So these complementary strategies. So building the skill base, that's the evidence of complementarity. So you're absolutely right. You read my story well. I agree. But I don't want to be in the position that all affirmative action is bad. But I think sometimes it diverts attention from where the effective policy could really be.
Just in
And-
that case,
yes.
sorry, just one. But what about socioeconomic-based policies in that case? Are those more sensible? Will those make more sense?
Well, but you see, you're getting at a key part of the story, and it's an interesting question. If you look, for example, at in Chicago, we no longer have a very dangerous and very unpleasant project at one time called the Robert Taylor Homes. Robert Taylor Homes were basically a cesspool of people of poverty, where you had gangs roaming the streets, you had children growing up, seeing people murdered, there was a lot of violence, and so forth. And so people would say, well, children, and the families were generally very poor. A lot of the mothers were on welfare. But what was amazing was the vast majority of the kids that came out of those homes were children who actually grew up in those projects. They actually grew up in those projects. They were exposed to the violence. And what was the key to their success? It was, generally speaking, that the family provided environments, the mother or relatives provided a protective shield. And so what you could do then, it wasn't just a question of giving the money. The welfare payments went part of the way. We saw that giving welfare payments to children in one generation, or parents in one generation, did not change the social mobility in the next generation. So change, and in fact, it maybe have had a dangerous effect of isolating people, making them somehow withdraw from the larger society. But what we found in those homes was that many of the children who succeeded came from families that were providing pretty rich parenting, even though they had poor family resources. So that's why I want to think more deeply about what we mean by disadvantage. It's not so I know there are disadvantaged children out there. There are disadvantaged children among the middle class and even among the affluent in some fundamental sense, parents who don't get parenting. We know novels are written about by people who grew up with families that were quite wealthy, but the parents had no love, no concern, no development. But generally we find that the measure of parenting is really the greater measure of disadvantage. And I think that's the key lesson. But if I were to say now we have a very fine targeted measure of parenting, and I could tell you, we can identify where disadvantage really is, I would say we're looking in that direction. We have some ideas about that, and I think they're getting stronger and stronger. But it's not just a question of money. So books are written by saying money doesn't matter. Well, of course, money matters. Money matters for a lot of things. But the idea of just redistribution, which is what the Gatsby curve, which is this curve between the intergenerational income elasticity and income inequality, that curve I drew at the very beginning, that I think leads too much to the idea of redistribution as the measure. I think we want to think more broadly about what poverty really means and what aspects of poverty we want to target. So yes, I'd say yes and no. Parts of it, yes, parts of it, no.
Thank you. Okay. One more question, if you have.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that enlightening speech. You've convinced us of the importance of early childhood education and getting involved with the early years of a child. Where do you think that money should come from? Is it public? Is it federal? Is it city level? Is it church? Where is it coming from?
Again, a very good question. And this is a case where I would argue, see, there are two different questions here. You can argue, well, what's the case for public provision of education? I think many people of all political persuasions see a very powerful role for public provision of things like education, libraries, and so forth. So I would say, yes, there are serious social consequences of not providing these resources. So I would say that money should come from public sources in part. But I think it's very important that even if the public bears, and it's generally going to be the case for substantial sums of money to be put into disadvantaged children, that the public sector has to mobilize those resources. But the provision of those services, the actual way the schools are implemented, should probably involve both the public sector and the private sector, partly to promote competition among the sectors, but also to recognize, at least it's true in the United States, it may be less true in Japan, that children from different socioeconomic groups, children with different values, and the parents really have different goals. I mean, we can think about early childhood education. And in fact, one of the big barriers to political support for early childhood education has been the notion that the early years of the child should not be something that the government gets into. So for all the more reason, you would want private actors, churches. You'd want to have temples. You'd want to have groups of people, private organizations. In the United States, there have been businessmen who have actually organized interventions, which have brought not only mobilized resources, supplemented government, but have also provided a choice which is sensitive to the cultural needs of various socioeconomic and ethnic groups. So I think you want that kind of sensitivity. So you want to engage the private sector in the execution of those, in the design. It's not the case that early childhood programs are just an extension of the public schools, because this is a time in the life of the child that involves much more this kind of intense parenting interaction. And you can use this as a vehicle. So you could have an Islamic state, a Buddhist group, a group of people who are Christians, Jews, various kinds of religious groups, Catholics, Protestants, providing somewhat different curricula, but with targeting these basic capabilities. I think most people agree they want their children to be more intelligent, to be self-controlled, and so forth. So on top of that, value, because that's also the time when values are promoted. And it's also the time that you have to respect individual values that families might have. So I would want to engage the private sector and all of the cultural and social institutions. Yes, the public sector for funds, but also the private sector for funds, and the private sector, certainly, to work with the public sector to provide kind of a menu of choice, because the family has to be engaged. You can't impose this on families. You have to engage the parents. In fact, the engagement of the parents can sometimes be the most important part of this whole enterprise.
Thank you very much.